picture this. Okay, it is 1839.
Right.
You've got this wealthy teenage heir to a massive, just highly profitable industrial empire. And he's sitting at his desk in a merchant shipping office.
Doing his daily grind.
Exactly. He is supposed to be, crunching profit margins, updating the ledgers, basically learning how to one day take over the whole family business.
Right, being the good son.
But instead, and this is where it gets crazy, he is secretly drafting this blistering undercover expose about how his own family's social circle is, well, literally working their employees to death.
Yeah, it's wild.
And he knows that if his father catches him, he will likely be completely disowned. So, welcome to the deep dive.
It really is like the ultimate act of high-stakes teenage rebellion, isn't it?
Totally.
But instead of sneaking out to a party or something, he's sneaking out into the philosophical underground.
Right. And today we are focusing on you, the listener, and our mission is to unpack this very specific, incredibly transformative window of time in the life of a young Friedrich Engels.
A very young Engels.
Yeah. We are diving deep into Volume 2 of the Marx and Engels collected works. And this covers the years 1838 to 1842.
Right.
And I got to say, the sources we have today are just a wild mix. I mean, we are pulling from early journalistic exposés, these highly opinionated private letters to his drinking buddies.
Which are fantastic, by the way.
They really are. Plus, dense philosophical pamphlets, and yes, even his angsty teenage poetry.
Which we definitely have to talk about. But to establish the context right out of the gate here, this volume covers the crucial years before this young thinker famously teamed up with Karl Marx in 1844.
Right, pre-Marx.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That is vital to understand. We are looking at a period of completely independent intellectual evolution.
Because people always group them together.
Always. But this is a young man navigating the absolute labyrinth of 19th century German philosophy all on his own, while simultaneously, slamming headfirst into the grim physical realities of early industrialization.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we do tend to think of these historical figures as just, hatching out of an egg with all their grand theories perfectly formed.
Right, like they were born with a manifesto in hand.
Exactly. But this volume, it captures the incredibly chaotic, just painful soul-searching of a young man trying desperately to break free from his deeply conservative upbringing.
Yeah, and if we want to understand the theories that later shook the world, we really have to understand the environment that produced the theorist in the first place.
Makes sense.
And in this case, that environment was Barmen. It's a town in the Wuppertal region of Germany. He was born there in 1820 into a wealthy, conservative, and just deeply religious family.
Right.
His father, Friedrich Engels Sr., was a prominent industrialist. He was a textile manufacturer who owned mills in Germany and eventually over in England, too.
So he is born into, like, the 1% of the 19th century.
Oh, absolutely. The 0.1%.
Right. He is not on the outside looking in, throwing rocks at the gates. He is sitting right in the plush lap of the early capitalist machinery.
Right in the dead center of it. And the expectation, as the eldest son, was that he would eventually take over this sprawling textile empire.
No pressure.
Right. But the father-son dynamic here is incredibly tense. I mean, his father actually forced him to leave the gymnasium, which is sort of the German equivalent of an academic high school, a year early.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Before he could even finish his final examinations and qualify for university, his dad just pulls him out.
Just yanks him out of school.
Yep. To go work as a clerk in the family business.
Hold on. So this guy, who goes on to become one of the most famous intellectuals in modern history, who writes volumes of this dense economic and political theory, he was essentially a high school dropout.
Technically speaking, yes. He was completely denied a formal university education. He had to complete his education entirely independently. He was self-taught from that moment on. And the sources point out that this created a tremendous amount of psychological friction for him.
I bet. Why exactly, though?
Well, because it was actually much harder for him to arrive at a progressive, radical outlook compared to someone like Marx.
Why is that?
Yes.
Just because he was richer?
Mostly because of his physical proximity to the system. I mean, Marx was a university student, right?
Right.
Surrounded by radical thinkers in a somewhat academic, theoretical bubble. But Engels was literally embedded in the counting house of the capitalist machinery.
I see.
He had a front row seat to the daily mechanics of the exploitation, but he was also a direct beneficiary of it.
Okay, that makes total sense. It's like being the heir to a massive fossil fuel empire, right?
Okay, yeah.
And you're being forced to work in the corporate office analyzing extraction yields. But secretly, You're using your lunch breaks to study environmental science and write radical manifestos about dismantling the oil industry.
That is a brilliant way to frame it.
I mean, the cognitive dissonance must have been deafening for him.
Oh, it had to be. He's spending his days participating in a system that his independent reading at night is telling him is fundamentally flawed.
Right.
But what's crucial to understand about this early period, and the sources make this very, very clear, is that his rebellion did not start with economics or politics.
It didn't.
No, it started with religion.
Oh, right. His family practiced pietism.
Exactly.
Let's break that down for the listener because it's not a term we hear much today. Pietism was a very strict, orthodox, conservative branch of Protestantism, right?
Yes. Think of it as a deeply ascetic, really inward-looking religious movement.
Okay.
Pietism emphasized intense personal piety, rigorous moral policing, and this constant, agonizing self-examination for sin.
Sounds exhausting.
Very much so. Joy, leisure, art, secular literature, all of these things were often viewed with just deep suspicion.
So no dancing, no drinking, no reading fun novels.
Yeah.
Just constant guilt and praying.
Essentially, yes. And the text notes that the young Engels had to engage in what they call painful soul-searching to overcome these religious convictions that had basically been beaten into him since childhood.
Man.
The letters to his school friends, the Graeber brothers, who are actually studying theology to become pastors, by the way.
Oh, the irony.
Right. Those letters are just full of this tension.
I mean, if I'm putting myself in his shoes, he's terrified, right?
Absolutely.
When you were raised in an environment that tells you questioning the literal truth of the Bible means eternal damnation, you don't just shed that overnight.
You really don't. It is an excruciating process. The letters show him reading rationalist theologians, questioning the literal interpretation of the Bible, pointing out contradictions in the Gospels to the Graeber brothers.
Just debating his pastor friends.
Yeah. And he writes about the sheer terror of losing his faith, but his intellect simply will not let him ignore the contradictions he's finding. Religion and theology were really the initial mechanisms, the vehicles that forced him to start questioning the status quo. I mean, if the authority of his father's religion was flawed, what other authorities might be flawed?
Right. It's the domino effect. It's that classic coming-of-age moment. But the stakes feel literally eternal to him.
Exactly.
And this internal friction, this secret rebellious streak, it didn't just stay locked in his head. It first leaked out into the world through a medium I never, ever would have associated with him.
Poetry.
Yes, poetry.
It is a surprising pivot, for sure. But at just 18 years old, he becomes a regular contributor to the press. And his very first published work wasn't some dry economic treatise.
Right.
It was a poem called The Bedouin, published in September 1838.
Okay, let's talk about the Bedouin. The sources say this poem breathed a spirit of liberty. But, I mean, what does a poem about a desert nomad have to do with a teenager in a German industrial town?
It's all about the symbolism.
Okay.
In the highly romanticized imagery of 19th century literature, the Bedouin represents absolute untamed freedom. Okay.
The desert nomad is unbounded by the stifling, smog-choked, rule-obsessed society of bourgeois Europe.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, by writing about a Bedouin, he is projecting his own desperate desire to escape the counting house and the pietist guilt of barmen.
So it's pure escapism, but with a political edge to it.
Precisely.
And he initially dreamed of the poet's laurels, right? Like he genuinely wanted to be a great literary figure.
He did, but one of the most remarkable things about him, even as a teenager, was his razor-sharp critical self-awareness.
Yeah.
His letters from this period show a mature realization that poetry just wasn't his true vocation.
He knew he wasn't that good.
Kind of. He openly admits to his friends that while some of his poems were decent, many were just pale imitations of the great romantic poets of the era. He knew he wasn't going to be the next Goethe.
Which takes a lot of humility for an 18-year-old guy to admit.
It really does.
But the sources do note that while his serious romantic poetry might have been imitative, his epigrams and his satirical parodies were highly original.
Oh, absolutely. When he was making fun of things, his writing actually had teeth.
He had a tremendous wit and phenomenal flair for languages, which, becomes vital later on when he needs to read international economic reports.
Right, because you need to read the sources in their original language.
Exactly. Even as a teenager, he was reading widely in several languages. The sources mentioned he translated the Spanish poet M.J. Quintana's work, specifically a piece called On the Invention of Printing.
Okay, wait. That choice of subject matter cannot be an accident.
Not at all.
The invention of the printing press, That's the ultimate tool for spreading radical ideas and breaking the monopoly on information.
Yeah, even in his translation choices, you can see the cogs turning in his head.
He was magnetically drawn to literature that championed freedom and humanism, wasn't he?
He was. You see this most heavily in his deep admiration for the English poet Percy Bysshe Shelley.
Okay, Shelley is fascinating here
Yeah.
because we think of him today as this romantic figure, Frankenstein's author's husband.
Right. Mary Shelley's husband.
Yeah, writing about clouds and skylarks and all that soft stuff. But to a young, frustrated German teenager, Shelley was actually a dangerous radical.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Shelley was a massive figure for him because Shelley combined beautiful lyricism with a furious, unapologetic protest against political oppression and religious dogma.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, Shelley was a highly vocal atheist and a political radical back in England.
See, there's this one detail in the sources that I absolutely loved about this.
What's that?
Engels wrote a poem called An Evening, and he used a phrase from Shelley as the epigraph. The phrase was, "Tomorrow comes."
Ah, yes.
And it reflected this deep, stubborn conviction he had that the dark, conservative despair hovering over Germany at the time would eventually yield to what he called Freedom's Day.
And he didn't just write abstractly about freedom or tomorrow either.
No.
No. In the summer of 1839, he wrote an ode on the anniversary of the July 1830 French Revolution. And he sent it to his friend Friedrich Engels. In it, he celebrates revolution not as some terrifying, chaotic breakdown of law and order, which is exactly how his father and his social class viewed it, right?
Right, they would have been terrified of a revolution.
Exactly. But he describes it as a surge of vital energy among the masses. He literally describes the revolution as a popular festival.
A popular festival, that is a wildly radical reframing of a bloody revolution.
It really is.
I mean, if you're a rich factory owner, a revolution is a mob coming for your property with pitchforks. But this teenager is looking across the border to France and saying, no, that's a street party for human liberation.
Which is such a massive ideological leap from where he was raised.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But, recognizing his own limits as a poet didn't stop him from writing. Instead, it fueled a pivot.
Right.
He shifts from romantic poetry to something much sharper, much more direct, and that is undercover journalism.
And this brings us to a crucial geographic and professional shift in his life.
Okay, lay it out for us.
So from July 1838 to March 1841, his father sent him away from his hometown of Barmen to work as a clerk at Consul Leupold's trading house.
Okay.
And this was in the port city of Bremen.
So he's still doing the mercantile thing, he's still chained to a desk, but he's in Bremen now. How is Bremen different from Barmen?
Well, Bremen is a major seaport. It is cosmopolitan.
Oh, I see.
Ships are coming in from all over the world, bringing foreign newspapers, foreign books, and most importantly, foreign ideas.
Like a hub of information.
Exactly. It was significantly more liberal than the stifling, deeply religious atmosphere of Barmen. And this breathing room in Bremen gave him the space to really start writing.
Right.
He began contributing to the Telegraph for Deutschland, which was a prominent journal edited by Karl. It was the mouthpiece of a literary and political movement known as Young Germany.
Okay, here's where the story kicks into high gear. In the spring of 1839, at the ripe old age of 18, he publishes his first major piece of journalism.
A huge milestone.
It's an exposé called Letters from Wuppertal. Let's spend some time here because this piece seems like a massive turning point.
It absolutely was.
So what exactly was the Wuppertal and what was he exposing?
The Wuppertal is the river valley region that included his hometowns of Barmen and Elberfeld.
Right.
It was one of the most heavily industrialized areas in Germany at the time. And what he does in these letters is utterly pull back the curtain on the supposedly pious, prosperous, industrial towns of his youth.
The sources outline the terrifying conditions he wrote about. And we have to be clear here. He wasn't talking about abstract philosophy anymore.
No, not at all.
He was describing the physical suffering of real people. He wrote about the widespread disease, the rampant drunkenness among the poor working class, and the horrific, just suffocating conditions inside the factories.
Let's look at the mechanics of what he was actually describing.
Yeah, please.
He detailed how the factory workers, including young children, were breathing in textile dust all day long in these poorly ventilated rooms.
Oh, horrific.
He described the river Wupper itself, which was, the lifeblood of the valley being choked and turned blood red by the chemical dyes being dumped directly into it by the factories.
Wow. If you're wondering how scandalous this expose was, just imagine a modern tech CEO's kid anonymously publishing an article on Reddit, right?
Perfect analogy.
just detailing the exact human rights abuses happening in their parents' overseas supply chain, naming the toxic chemicals being dumped, and knowing they'd be completely disowned if caught.
That is exactly what this felt like back then. And more than just exposing the environmental and physical degradation, he was actively critiquing his own family's social class.
Right.
He painted a devastating portrait of the German bourgeoisie. He explicitly called out their, quote, Philistinism, obscurantism, and religious bigotry.
Let me stop you right there. Obscurantism. That is a great $10 word. But what does that actually look like in practice in an 1830s German town?
It's a very specific critique.
How was his class practicing obscurantism?
Well, obscurantism is basically the practice of deliberately preventing the facts or full details of something from becoming known.
Keeping people in the dark.
Exactly.
Right.
In Barman, it meant the wealthy factory owners actively suppressing the education of the working class. They didn't want the workers reading secular literature or political tracts. They wanted them reading only the Bible, specifically the parts that told them to be obedient to their earthly masters.
So they were using religion as a literal tool for social control.
That is exactly the conclusion he reached. He essentially argued that their intense outward show of pietist religion was just a mask.
A cover-up.
Right. It was a convenient moral cover for the absolute inhuman exploitation of the factory workers.
That's sickening.
He pointed out that the factory owners would go to church on Sunday, sing hymns, weep over their own minor sins, and then on Monday morning send children back into the suffocating, dye-soaked factories for 12-hour shifts.
And these were factories owned by people he knew.
People he grew up around.
People his father went to church with. Possibly even his own father's factories.
Which is exactly why the Wuppertal letters are so vital. This is the exact moment his attention was drawn permanently to the physical contradictions of society.
The real-world impact.
Yes. The Wuppertal letters were the crucial stimulus that caused him to begin turning his back on the bourgeois outlook entirely.
You couldn't unsee it.
He saw that the immense wealth of his class was directly extracted from the misery and the shortened lifespans of the people working the looms.
But this raises a huge mechanical question for me.
Okay, what's that?
How on earth did he reconcile publishing these fiery, devastating critiques of his hometown's factory owners while still working as a merchant clerk?
Right?
I mean, he's relying on his father to fund his life, right? Did he just mail this to the newspaper and hope his dad didn't read it?
Oh, no, he absolutely had to hide his identity. He published the letters from Wuppertal under a pseudonym.
Ah, okay. What was it?
Friedrich Oswald.
Friedrich Oswald. It's like his superhero alter ego.
Pretty much.
Or, I guess, his super radical alter ego. By day, a mild-mannered shipping clerk calculating freight costs.
And by night, Friedrich Oswald, the fiery journalist tearing down the establishment.
I love that.
He had to use a pseudonym for two main reasons. First, the social and familial fallout.
Sure.
If his father had known that his eldest son was writing radical exposés about their own social circle in a national left-wing journal, the consequences would have been severe.
Cut off completely.
Financial cutoff, social exile, everything. Second, and honestly more dangerously, state censorship in Prussia at this time was incredibly strict.
How strict are we talking? Like, what would happen if the censors figured out who Friedrich Oswald actually was?
Under the Carlsbad decrees and subsequent crackdowns, the Prussian state heavily monitored the press for anything deemed subversive, democratic, or anti-religious.
Okay.
If the state identified him, the publication would be shut down, the editor could be jailed, and he himself could face imprisonment or exile for sedition.
Oh, wow. So the stakes are incredibly high, which explains why the sources mention that his true, completely uncensored political convictions from this time are actually only found in his private letters.
Right. The letters back home to his sister Marie and to his school friends, the Graeber brothers. Because of the state censors and his family, the letters basically became his intellectual laboratory.
Let's talk about these letters because they sound like incredible historical documents.
They really are. They reveal a young man with just a tremendous zest for life.
Yeah.
Yeah, he writes to his sister and his friends about drinking beer, fencing, reading everything he can get his hands on, listening to Beethoven, smoking cigars.
He sounds like a very normal, highly energetic young guy.
He was. But interwoven with all that normal chatter, they reveal a deep, visceral hatred for despotism.
Okay.
A hatred for the arbitrary rule of monarchs and for the social arrogance of the aristocracy.
He was essentially using his friends as sounding boards, right?
Exactly.
The sources note that the original ideas that later made him famous ideas, he would eventually publish in his articles of literary and social criticism, they were first test-driven in these private letters to his buddies back home.
It was a safe space to bypass the censors. You have to remember, the mail was relatively private compared to the printed press.
Right, no one's pre-reading your mail like they pre-read a newspaper.
Exactly. He could say what he actually thought without fear of the police knocking on his door, provided his friends didn't hand the letters over, of course.
And what he thought was changing rapidly. Because seeing the physical suffering of the workers in the Wuppertal Valley was one thing. Exposing it in the press was a great first step.
Right.
But to truly understand why it was happening, to understand the structural mechanics of it, he felt he needed a new theoretical framework.
And that led him deep into the philosophical underground of the time.
So yeah, let's dive into that.
This is where we have to map his journey through the philosophical labyrinth of 19th century Germany. This is perhaps the densest part of his intellectual evolution, but it's crucial.
Well, we can handle it.
Okay, so, as we mentioned earlier, he initially supported the Young Germany movement when he first got to Bremen.
Right. Let's break down Young Germany. Who were they and what did they actually want?
Young Germany was a loose group of writers and journalists, people like Ludwig Börne.
Okay.
They were pushing for things that seem incredibly basic to us today, but were radically dangerous in 1830s Prussia.
Like what?
A written constitution, freedom of the press, the abolition of religious coercion, and even women's emancipation.
Women's emancipation in the 1830s. That is remarkably ahead of its time.
It was. And initially, our young Friedrich Oswald is totally on board with them. He's writing for their journals.
Sure.
But as sharp as he was, he soon began to see the inconsistencies and the limitations in the Young Germany platform.
What were the limitations? I mean, if they wanted freedom of the press and equality, what was the problem?
The problem was that Young Germany was purely reactive.
Reactive how?
They were great at pointing out what was wrong with society. Censorship is bad, religious coercion is bad. But they lacked a cohesive, rigorous philosophical system for understanding how history and society actually function.
Ah, they didn't have a grand theory.
Exactly. They were just liberal journalists asking for reforms without understanding the root causes of the oppression.
Treating the symptoms, not the disease.
Yes. He realized that just asking the king nicely for a constitution wasn't going to fundamentally change the Wuppertal factories.
So, feeling that Young Germany is too shallow, he moves on. He needs a heavier intellectual toolkit.
And that brings him to Hegel.
Yes, Hegel. Okay, I have to admit, I've tried reading Hegel and my brain basically melted.
It happens to the best of us.
He is notoriously incomprehensible.
Yeah.
How does a 19-year-old shipping clerk essentially teach himself Hegelian dialectics in his off hours?
It requires immense dedication, which he obviously had. But to understand why he bothered, we have to understand the grip Hegel had on Germany at the time.
Okay, set the scene.
Hegel had died in 1831, a few years prior to this, but his philosophy was absolutely dominant in the Prussian universities.
He was the guy.
He was the guy. Hegel provided exactly what Young Germany lacked. He had a massive, comprehensive system that explained the entire forward movement of human history.
All right, I need you to explain Hegelian philosophy to me like I am not a 19th century academic.
Yeah.
What is the actual mechanism of Hegel's idea?
Okay, let's use a metaphor.
Love metaphors.
Think of human history not as a straight, smooth line of progress, but as a pendulum swinging violently.
Okay, a pendulum. I'm with you.
According to Hegel's dialectical method, society pushes hard in one direction to establish a status quo. Hegel called this the thesis.
The thesis. Got it.
But every status quo inherently creates its own contradictions and internal flaws.
Sure.
This eventually triggers an inevitable, violent pushback in the exact opposite direction. This is the antithesis.
So action and reaction.
Exactly, but it doesn't just swing back and forth forever. The clash between the thesis and the antithesis eventually resolves.
Okay.
They smash together and settle into a new, evolved, higher middle ground. Hegel called this the synthesis.
The synthesis. Okay, this is actually tracking.
And then that new synthesis becomes the new status quo. So the new thesis and the process starts all over again.
Ah, constant cycle of leveling up.
Yes. This constant clash of opposing ideas is how human freedom slowly expands over time.
That actually makes a lot of sense. It gives history a motor. It's not just random events. It's a structural process of conflict and resolution.
Exactly.
But how did that help a kid worried about factory workers in Barmen?
Well, here is where Hegel's legacy fractured.
Oh, there was a split.
A huge split.
Yeah.
The conservative followers of Hegel, they were called the Old Hegelians, looked at the authoritarian Prussian state and the Orthodox Church, and they declared, Behold, Prussia is the ultimate synthesis. History has reached its perfect endpoint.
Wait, really? We made it, guys. The oppressive king is the ultimate evolution of human freedom.
That's literally what they argued.
I can see why the government liked that version of Hegel.
Of course they did. They used Hegel to justify the existing oppressive status quo. But the radical wing of his students, known as the young Hegelians, looked at the exact same dialectical method and drew the opposite conclusion.
What did they say?
They said, no, the Prussian state and the Orthodox religion are just the current thesis. They are full of contradictions, which means an antithesis is coming to clash with them, and history is going to move forward.
So they weaponized Hegel.
They absolutely did. They used his method as a weapon to critique religion and the state.
And our young shipping clerk, already hating the religious hypocrisy of his hometown, naturally gravitates toward the young Hegelians.
It was a perfect fit.
He realizes that history isn't over. The factories and the king aren't the final stage of humanity.
Precisely. But he doesn't stop there either.
Of course he doesn't.
Because there is a fatal flaw in Hegel's system, at least in the eyes of these young radicals, Hegel was an idealist.
Okay, what does idealist mean in this context? Because today, being an idealist just means you're highly optimistic, right?
Right. But in philosophy, idealism means that the ultimate reality of the universe is based on ideas, consciousness, or spirit.
Okay.
Hegel believed that all of human history was just the world spirit or absolute idea slowly realizing itself through human events. The physical world was just a reflection of spiritual ideas.
So ideas create reality.
Yes, that's idealism. But in 1841, a philosopher named Ludwig Feuerbach drops an absolute bombshell on the young Hegelians.
Oh, I've heard of Feuerbach. What did he do?
Feuerbach publishes a book called The Essence of Christianity, and Feuerbach flips Hegel completely upside down.
How so?
Feuerbach argues for materialism.
Materialism, okay.
He argued that humans created God in our own image, not the other way around.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he said that we take all of our highest human qualities, love, justice, power, wisdom, we strip them away from ourselves, project them up into the sky, call it God, and then bow down and worship it.
That is a massive theological grenade to throw into 1840s Germany.
It was explosive. Feuerbach shifted the focus from abstract ideas, idealism, to the physical, material world, materialism. The material conditions of human life create our ideas, not the other way around.
Okay, I want to make sure I grasp the gravity of this shift, because moving from idealism to materialism isn't just an academic debate. How does this actually change our young clerk's political views?
Think about the mechanism of change.
Okay.
If you are an idealist and you believe God or the absolute idea is driving history, then the terrifying poverty in the Wuppertal factories is ordained by God.
Right. It's a spiritual problem.
Exactly. You can only fix it through prayer or changing people's hearts. But if you are a materialist...
If you're a materialist, then God didn't create poverty. Humans created poverty through physical material systems like capitalism and factory ownership. And if humans created it, humans have the power to destroy it and build a new system.
You've hit the nail on the head. That is the exact logical bridge he crossed.
That is so powerful.
It is. If we connect this to the bigger picture, he critically analyzed these philosophies at each stage. He took the demand for political freedom from the young Germans. He took the dialectical method of historical conflict from Hegel. And he took the focus on the physical, human world from Feuerbach.
So he synthesized them into his own unique theoretical toolkit.
He didn't just adopt a philosophy wholesale, he built his own.
And this intense period of reading, writing, and clerking in Bremen eventually had to come to an end.
It did.
The final phase of the timeline in Volume 2 sees him moving geographically, which perfectly mirrors his ultimate ideological shift.
Right. So in September 1841, he leaves Bremen and moves to Berlin.
Berlin, big city.
Very big. He lives there for exactly 1 year until September 1842. But he's not there as a university student.
What's he doing?
He's there as an army volunteer.
Wait, he joined the army?
Well, it was compulsory military service for young Prussian men. He served his time in the Prussian artillery.
Okay, so he's an artilleryman.
Yeah, but Berlin was the absolute epicenter of the young Hegelian movement. So by day, he is in a military uniform learning how to fire cannons for the King of Prussia.
I love this imagery.
Right. And in his off hours, he is attending university lectures as an auditor, hanging out in the underground cafes with the most radical intellectuals in Europe, and furiously writing philosophical pamphlets attacking the state.
All Still anonymously, of course.
Always anonymously. He was rubbing shoulders with a group of radicals who called themselves Die Freien, the Free Ones.
The Free Ones. Sounds like a rebellious college fraternity.
That's essentially what they were. They drank heavily, debated late into the night, and challenged every established norm of society.
The guy never stopped. By day, he's a soldier. By night, a radical philosopher.
A double life.
But then, right at the end of 1842, his life takes its most significant geographic turn yet. The final piece of the puzzle falls into place.
Yes, in November 1842, his father, perhaps sensing his son is getting a little too radical in Berlin, though not knowing the full extent, decides it's time for him to really focus on the family business.
Back to the counting house.
Exactly. He sends him to Manchester, England, to work at the Marx and Engels cotton mill.
The move to Manchester is the catalyst that ignites everything he has learned, isn't it?
Absolutely. If Berlin was the center of European philosophy, Manchester in 1842 was the beating heart of the global industrial revolution.
Right.
It was the absolute bleeding edge of the future of capitalism, operating at maximum speed, maximum profit, and maximum human brutality.
And the sources show that by late 1842, right around the time he leaves Berlin for Manchester, his philosophical journey had reached a critical destination.
It had.
He had taken Feuerbach's materialism and Hegel's idea of historical conflict and combined them. He had come to the realization of the transforming role of revolution in history.
He was no longer just asking for press freedom or critiquing religion. He was now openly advocating for revolutionary methods to remove the social and political barriers in Germany.
He realized the system wouldn't fix itself.
Exactly. He realized that the wealthy factory owners were never going to voluntarily give up their power and wealth just because philosophers wrote nice essays asking them to. The dialectic required a clash.
And so, by the end of 1842, at just 22 years old, right as he steps off the boat in England, he had officially become an advocate for the communist reconstruction of society.
Now, the sources are careful to point out a crucial nuance here. At this stage, in late 1842, he still viewed communism largely in utopian terms.
What does utopian terms mean in this specific context?
It means he saw communism primarily as a moral and philosophical necessity.
Okay.
He saw the suffering, he knew the current system was historically doomed, and he believed a perfectly egalitarian society was the necessary next step for human freedom.
But he didn't have the math yet.
Exactly. He hadn't yet worked out the rigorous, hard math economic mechanisms of how capitalism would inevitably collapse, or how the working class would organize to overthrow it.
That's the Marx stuff later.
Right. That economic rigor is what he and Marx would spend the rest of their lives developing. But the core conviction, the moral imperative, was fully cemented before they even met.
Synthesizing this entire timeline from Volume 2 is just staggering when you lay it all out.
It really is.
It maps a rapid, almost breathless intellectual evolution. In 4 short years, he goes from a rebellious teenager writing romantic poetry about Bedouins to an undercover journalist exposing his own family's factories, to a radical Hegelian idealist debating in Berlin cafes, to a materialist, and finally to a committed utopian communist arriving in Manchester.
And we have to remind the listener again, all of this takes place 2 full years before his legendary lifelong partnership with Karl Marx even begins.
That is the most mind-blowing part to me.
It proves definitively from the sources that this young man was not just Marx's sidekick or a wealthy patron who popularized Marx's ideas, which is a very common historical misconception.
Right.
He brought his own, fully formed, independently developed, incredibly rigorous theoretical framework to the table.
They arrived at the same place from completely different directions.
Exactly. Marx got there through deep academic study in the university. He got there through direct, hands-on, daily experience with the actual machinery of industrial capitalism in Bremen and Wuppertal, combined with a grueling process of philosophical self-education.
So what does this all mean? After unpacking all of this, why should you, the listener, care about dissecting the teenage years of a 19th century German philosopher?
It's a valid question.
I think it speaks directly to how overwhelming it can be to navigate today's flood of information. Think about it. We are constantly told what to think by our algorithms, by our environment, by our family's expectations, by the economic class we are born into.
It is very easy. In fact, it is the default human setting to just accept the parameters of the world you were born into. If you're born the heir to a factory, you justify the factory.
Exactly. But this young thinker's journey proves that true education isn't just about accumulating facts. True education is a grueling process of unlearning.
Very true.
It's about critically questioning the environment and the dogmas you were raised in. It's about having the courage to look at the undeniable physical human suffering in the world, recognizing your own complicity in it, even if your dad owns the factory, and not being afraid to completely change your worldview to address it.
It is a profound process of intellectual emancipation. I mean, he had every material reason to stay quiet, inherit his millions, and live a comfortable life singing hymns on Sunday.
He chose the friction instead.
He leaned into it.
So, to quickly recap this incredible journey for you, we started with the rebellious son of a wealthy barman industrialist, chafing against the paralyzing guilt of his pietist upbringing. We saw him try on the identity of a romantic teenage poet dreaming of desert freedom. We watched him become the undercover journalist Friedrich Oswald, risking his inheritance to expose the deadly hypocrisy of his own social class.
A massive risk.
And finally, we tracked his path as a radical philosopher, navigating the complex dialectics of Hegel and the materialism of Feuerbach, before stepping onto the smoky docks of Manchester as a committed revolutionary.
It's a remarkable trajectory. And looking at all these sources, the letters, the poetry, the journalism, it leaves me with a final thought that wasn't explicitly discussed in the source material, but seems incredibly relevant to our modern experience.
Oh, what's that? Let's hear it.
Consider the role of the Telegraph for Deutschland and his vast, frantic network of private letters to his friends. For a young man in the 1830s and 40s, this was his social media.
Oh, wow. I love that comparison.
Right. This was how he found his community of dissidents, how he debated, and how he test drove his most dangerous ideas.
The Postal Service is 19th century Reddit.
Exactly. But the friction was incredibly high. Letters took days or weeks to arrive. Publishing an article required sneaking manuscripts past heavily armed state censors. Engaging with philosophy meant reading hundreds of pages of dense, punishing German text after working a 10-hour shift at a shipping desk.
It required deep, sustained, agonizing focus.
Yes, exactly.
Which really begs the question. If he were alive today, surrounded by the frictionless digital noise of the 21st century, the instant gratification, the endless scroll of 15-second videos, would he still have been able to find the quiet, sustained focus required to undergo such a profound, independent intellectual transformation?
Or would the algorithms of his comfortable, wealthy upbringing have successfully kept him in the conservative bubble his father intended?
Would the frictionless modern world have smoothed out the very friction that made him radical?
It's a provocative question for anyone trying to think independently today.
Are tools helping us unlearn our biases, or just reinforcing them faster? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Volume 2 of The Sources. We hope it shattered a few marble statues for you and showed you the messy, human assembly process behind the history. Keep on learning, keep questioning the world around you, and we'll catch you next time.